The notion that slavery as a practice itself was ever condemned or even questioned in the Bible is laughable.
Does Jesus ever actually say the words, I am God, or is that something that our modern eyes are reading back into the text? Do any of the omni properties typically associated with Adonai hold up?
No.
If you could Thanos snap one dogma and it instantly be gone from the world, which dogma would it be?
Oh gosh, there are a lot of them. The Bible is really an alien text, and the less we try to learn about its background and its history and its composition and its interpretation, the more we're just going to be bringing our intuitions to the text, and we're just going to make whatever meaning serves our interests.
Welcome, everyone, to Peel the Onion. I'm your host, Cody McLean, and today I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by the brilliant Dr. Dan McClellan, scholar, podcaster, and public communicator. Dan holds a bachelor's in ancient Near Eastern studies from BYU, a master's in Jewish studies from the University of Oxford, a second master's in biblical studies from Trinity Western University, and a PhD in theology and religion from the University of Exeter. And today we're going to be diving into how his newest book, The Bible Says So, unpacks the most pressing misunderstandings about Scripture. Dan, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Cody. I appreciate your time.
It's my understanding that we didn't receive the Bible in the same way we received the Ten Commandments. What actually happened? How did we end up with this particular set of books?
Well, we can't really speak about the Bible as like a single volume, a single book, until around the end of the 4th, beginning of the 5th century CE. Prior to that, overwhelmingly, people just referred to the Scriptures, which referred to independent texts that were considered to be kind of abstractly grouped together as the texts that were considered divinely inspired and authoritative. And that comes from an even broader set of texts that in earlier years, prior to this notion of delineating all these texts as the ones that are inspired and authoritative, there were a lot of texts that were considered scripture within early Judaism and even within early Christianity. And these texts come from all over, all different kinds of authors. They're written in all different kinds of genres. So they're really just the texts that became socioculturally significant for these groups of Jewish folks and then followers of Jesus. And there are certainly texts that were considered inspired and authoritative prior to the development of what we now refer to as the canon that fell out of favor by the time the walls were kind of constructed around the canon, and there were others that people had concerns and doubts about, and probably weren't going to be included into the canon until some person or some group of people made the decision, no, we want to keep these. So, for instance, the book of Revelation is an example of a text that in the earliest periods was rejected by an awful lot of the followers of Jesus, and then because of someone like Athanasius of Alexandria, was ultimately included. So there are a lot of different factors at play in where these texts came from, how they became socially significant, and then how this authoritative boundary was drawn around them. And a lot of it had to do with the church hierarchy and its structuring of power and values and boundaries. So the Bible is the end result of a very, very long process that involved an awful lot of people and was not really settled throughout the majority of that process. And even after we say, well, we have the biblical canon, it really wasn't firmly settled, because with the Protestant Reformation, we revisited what we were going to consider canon, and so a bunch of texts were kicked out of the canon and given, according to Protestants, kind of secondary status. That would be the Apocrypha. And then in the 19th century, Protestants said, you know what, we don't really like the Apocrypha at all. It doesn't have secondary status anymore. We're just ignoring it. And so these days, Protestants talk about a 66-book canon, but for the majority of the history of Christianity, there were 7 at least more texts that were usually considered part of the Bible. So a lot of scholars, myself included in the book, will point out that there's not really such thing as the Bible. Just like there's not really such thing as the dictionary. There are dictionaries, just like there are Bibles. But to say this is my Bible is to basically make a decision about manuscripts, about canon, about translations. There are a bunch of different decisions that go into what you determine to be the Bible. And so even today, it's, the question of what the Bible is can be considered open. It's
Hmm.
not really something that has been definitively nailed down for all people involved.
Hmm. Well, what are some of the books that didn't make it in, and what reasons were we given for them leaving them out?
There are a number. I think probably the most influential one, the one whose fingerprints we can see all over the text of the New Testament that made it in, is the Book of Enoch, or First Enoch, which is actually a collection of 5 different books under that one rubric. And these texts were written probably beginning in the late 4th century BCE down to around the 1st century CE. And this is the text that begins to innovate concepts of postmortem divine reward and punishment, and the
Hmm.
notion of a head malevolent angel who would ultimately become named Satan. And a
Hmm.
lot of the ideas about the end times that we find in the New Testament were influenced by the book of Enoch, and it was considered inspired and authoritative by an awful lot of folks, including people who wrote texts for the New Testament. So the epistle or the letter of Jude actually directly quotes from the book of Enoch, and refers to this quotation as a revelation that Enoch received.
Hmm.
And so that's very clearly something that author considers to be inspired scripture. And, when we look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are a bunch of texts that are preserved in more than one manuscript. And if you count up how many copies of each given text there are, you can kind of get a sense for which texts were considered most important.
Hmm.
And like the top 5 texts at Qumran: Genesis, Isaiah, Psalms, Deuteronomy, and First Enoch. So it was considered phenomenally important. But then by the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, you have people saying, did this text really survive from before the flood? And they were
Yeah.
pointing out, we've got some very weird doctrines being promoted in here, and also there's a lot of internally contradictory stuff. And so
Hmm.
by the 4th century CE, when the debate about firming up a canon really takes off in earnest in the second half of the 4th century CE, by that time, Enoch is mostly out of favor with folks. So, but not before some people took copies of the scriptures, the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, down to the kingdom of Aksum, modern-day Ethiopia. And First Enoch was included in the scriptures that they took down there. And that group of people was separate from the canon debates that were going on in the north. And so down to this day, the book of First Enoch is considered canonical for the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. But within a couple decades of that event, most Christians had said, we're not doing Book of Enoch anymore. And there are a number of other texts. The Wisdom of Solomon was a very influential
Hmm.
text that ultimately was omitted from the canon. Ben Sira was a text that was also influential and was omitted from the canon. There are some New Testament texts like the Shepherd of Hermas and the Epistle of Barnabas that are included in some of our earliest manuscripts that gather together all the texts of the New Testament, like the Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus, and they would ultimately be omitted from the canon. So there are an awful lot of texts that were kind of on the cusp that ended up not making it.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, Enoch is a very interesting piece of literature. Uh,
Yeah.
with the Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant Bibles, they don't all have the same number of books. You referenced this briefly. If Scripture
hmm
is inspired, why do we have these differences?
Because what counts as inspired scripture is debated. And some of this comes down to what language it was written in. For instance, the Hebrew Bible, as it is largely understood today, is these texts were all composed either in Hebrew or Aramaic. When you look at the Apocrypha, a lot of these texts seem to have been composed in Greek. And so while Christians, for the earliest followers of Jesus, the Bible was the Septuagint, was the ancient Greek translation. And so they couldn't really distinguish texts that were originally written in Hebrew from texts that were originally written in Greek. So it didn't really matter to them. But when Judaism began to firm up its canon, they omitted a lot of these texts that would have originally been written in Greek, Second Maccabees, for instance, and Ben Sira. And so when we get down to the Vulgate is mostly translating text from the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation. So that's the official Latin translation. So that's what is being used within the Catholic Church. But when we get down to the Protestant Reformation, something that Martin Luther does is returns to the Hebrew Bible and the Greek of the New Testament and translates the Bible himself. And when he goes to find the manuscripts, of the Hebrew Bible, the texts of the Apocrypha are not there. And this is one of the things that leads him to move them into a third category. He has Old Testament, New Testament, and then Apocrypha. So the texts that would have been composed in Greek are relegated to that other category. And so it really comes down to what language the folks are engaging the texts in and what their concerns are regarding, or what their criteria are regarding inclusion in the canon. If it comes down to what texts were considered authoritative in early Christianity, the Apocrypha overwhelmingly ought to be included. An awful lot of people speak of texts of the Apocrypha as authoritative. But if you say, no, we're going to go with the texts that were composed in Hebrew and are considered canonical by Jewish folks, which is what Martin Luther did, then you've got to omit the text of the Apocrypha. So these are all questions that one has to face, and they have to find answers for and develop criteria for how they're going to draw that line. And you just have different answers to these questions from different folks.
Absolutely. Well, how much did politics and church power shape canon compared to that of theology?
I think the politics and the church are what authorized the canon, but overwhelmingly, I think theology was the guiding force. Because when there are conspiracy theories out there that there were these councils that gathered together and they were like, look, we got all these books, we got to whittle it down. And so they've just voted on, this is out, this is in, this is out, this is in. And that's really not what happened. The councils are mainly just rubber stamps on decisions that had been made through other channels. So, for instance, you had a lot of people who would go out and basically poll the churches and say, what are the texts that you are using in your services that you consider inspired and authoritative and appropriate for church services? And then they just kind of made a list of what the texts are that are most consistently used among the churches. And so you had a few different categories that were discussed. The texts that were considered authoritative, you had the spurious texts, and then you had other texts that were like considered useful for private study or something like that, but not to be read in churches or something like that. So you had a bunch of different attempts to nail down what ought to be considered authoritative and what ought not to. And it was largely based on the consensus of the different congregations spread around Christendom to the degree that the authorities that were doing this could access them. So I think for the most part, the core of the canon was determined by theology, by the congregations, by the people who were using these texts in the services. And it was really the fuzzy edges that required a little more thumb on the scale from people who were in charge. So, for instance, Athanasius of Alexandria, his inclusion of Revelation, I think, was very much politically motivated because he was one of the first to take Revelation and say, so this is not just about us versus them in the sense of Christianity versus everybody else, because he wanted to identify the beast and the followers of the beast as other Christians who are not good enough. So he actually leveraged Revelation against other Christians. and particularly the ones he deemed heretics, whether they were Arians or others. And so the book of Revelation was very useful for him in his structuring of boundaries around good Christians and bad Christians. And so I think his inclusion of Revelation represents one of the more politically motivated canon decisions. But because of his power and influence, that was something everybody had to take seriously, and ultimately Revelation gets included in the canon.
Absolutely. With as many bishops that were in attendance at some of these councils, it's hard for me to imagine that we had unanimous decisions on some of these ideas and topics. Do we have any insight on that?
So when it comes to a lot of the canons, or excuse me, a lot of the councils, yeah, we had the the dissenters were like numbering in the single digits. So the Council of Nicaea, for instance, when it came to the question of Jesus's relationship to God, it was Arius and 3 or 4 others who objected to the Nicene Creed and who didn't want to sign off on it, and they would be, they were exiled afterwards, or
Hmm.
at least threatened with exile.
Hmm.
And so you did get kind of a situationally emergent kind of consensus among the folks who were there over and against a handful of dissenters. But it would be another century before Arianism would be really stamped out,
Hmm.
because afterwards you had a bunch of people who were like, no, I actually don't agree. And you even had an Arian emperor uh, in in Rome. And so uh, the power kind of shifted back and forth for a while until the middle of the 5th century is when Arianism kind of peters out. And so I think you have an overwhelming consensus in the sense that the overwhelming majority of participants are agreeing with one side frequently.
Hmm.
I don't know. I'm sure there were times when it was 100%, and I'm sure there were times when it was there was more parity, where it was more kind of 50-50, but
Hmm.
they would just continue on until they managed to convince people. It's kind of like if you imagine how the conclaves work for electing a pope,
Hmm.
initially nobody has an overwhelming majority, and then slowly and slowly the votes shift and people throw their allegiance to one side, or people make deals about how they're going to vote, and by the end of it, usually you have a huge majority voting for
Sure.
one person. So I think that's how those councils might have gone in some of the more controversial issues.
Absolutely. That's super interesting. The fact that it's 300 plus years removed from Christ, obviously, that's kind of where the consensus may have been in the year 300. But when we look at other Christianities in the first few centuries, is there a development to get to that unanimous decision? Or is it pretty much predominantly throughout Rome and the Middle East that's the consensus throughout the first 3 centuries?
I think you have more debate and more uh, variation in the earlier centuries, but
Hmm.
as this philosophical concern for a consensus view about things like the nature of Jesus's relationship to God, as that goes on, I think you see, as with the conclaves, people throw their support behind who they think is going to win. And
Right. Sure.
so you see a lot more pluriformity. You see a lot more disagreement in the 2nd and the 3rd centuries CE, but you begin to move towards a consensus view in the 3rd century, and by the 4th century, really Arius is kind of an outlier.
Hmm.
And Arius is sticking with what would have been considered traditional and not very problematic in the 2nd century,
Hmm.
or even in the early 3rd century CE. But by the 4th century CE, everybody's like, you got to get on board with this now. The rest of us are on board. And so what would have been considered unproblematic a century before his life is now considered anathema, is something that becomes like the main heresy of Christianity. And so I think as the debates wore on over the centuries, you get a lot more of a strong consensus, and that compels others who might disagree to throw in with the winning side, particularly if, once they have the support of the Roman Empire, then it becomes a matter of, they have the power to execute, they have the power to exile, they have all of this power that they can now put behind the firming up of that consensus. And so the dissenters are less and less motivated to maintain their dissent, and more motivated to jump on the winning side. So I think and then once you do have people who disagree with some of these arguments, and that's where you get schisms. That's where you get the Eastern and the Western Christianities dividing off, and you have these controversies about the Miaphysite and the Diaphysite and all these other controversies that result in basically kingdoms separating from each other. So once you get imperial power involved, the stakes go up significantly, and so the individuals, I think, see the writing on the wall, but then you get, where there is disagreement, you get division that results in these schisms that some of them get healed later on, and some of them are still ongoing.
Well, what do you think surprises people the most when they first start to look at the history of the Bible's formation?
That's an interesting question. I think there are people who are looking at the history of the Bible's formation, I think have probably been exposed to at least some of the things that they're going to discover. I think the thing that a lot of people struggle with is the fact that so much of what is in the Bible was written so long after the events that are being narrated. That's something that I think a lot of people struggle with, and sometimes don't want to come to terms with, particularly when it comes to things like, the book of Deuteronomy being written almost 1,000 years after the events it purports to narrate. And that's but it's kind of baked into the narrative, because you have these stories where it's like Moses did this and then they did this, and they set this thing up, and it is still there down to this very day. It's like, that's not what you say when you're there when it happened. That's something you say when this is some ancient old ruin that you can point to and say, see, it's still there down to this very day. And so I think that's something that may trouble some folks. But if folks are looking at the history of the composition of the Bible, hopefully they're doing so because they're willing and able to think critically about these things. I think another thing that might surprise them is just how arbitrary a lot of these decisions or consensuses regarding what is in and what is out feel. When it comes to the book of Revelation, if you look at the history of the debates, there were a lot of Christians who were like, yeah, this was not written by the author of the Gospel of John. This is not revelation. This is not inspired. This is weird, gross stuff. And as the debate rages on, fewer and fewer people are saying that, and then by the time you get to Athanasius of Alexandria, it's in. And so I think some people might be a little surprised by the arbitrariness of the process, and how there were things that everybody agreed was inspired for generations that ultimately get kicked out because of rather arbitrary decisions. I think that might surprise some folks. A really, really good book that I always recommend when people ask about the history of the Bible is by John Barton. It's called A History of the Bible. I think it's the best discussion out there of where the Bible comes from, as well as how it has traditionally been read by Jewish as well as Christian groups. So I always recommend that one, and there are plenty of surprises to find in there. One of the other things I think people might be surprised by is the fact that some of the earliest Christians and Jewish readers of the text kind of openly had to grapple with things they didn't like in the text, and they had to negotiate with the text and figure out ways to figure out interpretive lenses that they could generate and impose upon the text in order to make the more problematic things go away. And hopefully people recognize that there are certainly problematic things in the Bible, but if not, that might surprise them to find out about the ways they tried to get around the imprecatory psalms, and Psalm 137:9, blessed will be the one who smashes your babies against the rock, and stuff like that. They grappled with that, and they found ways to make that okay, or at least make the text okay. Maybe not the idea in the text.
Yeah, yeah, it's a trouble one.
Yeah.
I can attest to every single one of those things. They were all surprising to me as well. The New Testament dating, authorship, things of that nature. So I think you hit the nail on the head there. When Christians say the Bible is inspired, they usually quote 2 Timothy 3:16, but what does that verse originally mean? Was Paul even talking about the New Testament?
Well, the first thing to point out, which may be surprising to folks who are looking into how we got the Bible, is that most scholars don't think it was Paul who wrote this. Most scholars think this was written decades after Paul's death by somebody who is pretending to be Paul. In other words, it's pseudepigraphic. So 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus, the pastoral epistles, are widely acknowledged to be pseudepigraphic. And so the first thing to note is that this is probably coming at the beginning of the 2nd century CE. And so by this time period, if anything was considered scriptural among the writings of followers of Jesus, it would have been probably the Gospels and maybe the writings of Paul. The first indication that we have that any of the writings of Paul were considered scriptural is at the very end of 2 Peter, which was probably written even after the pastoral epistles. And so the text refers to the writings, the scriptures, which in this time period would have been an unbounded category. In other words, there was not a strict delineation of what is considered scripture and everything else is not. Scripture would have, what was included in that designation would have differed from person to person, from time to time, from place to place. But it's overwhelmingly focused on the text of the Hebrew Bible, or at least Jewish scripture. So it could have possibly included, like the Gospels, maybe the writings of Paul. It's not clear to me that that's the case, because it seems to me that the author is defending the utility of the Jewish scriptures specifically. So I think most scholars would say this is primarily, if not exclusively, referring to the Jewish scriptures. And if it is including anything from the New Testament, it would be probably just the Gospels, maybe also some of the writings of Paul. But it's certainly not the Bible as we know it today. But even beyond that, what exactly it's saying is something that I think a lot of scholars need to think twice about, because this is not, the word that is used there, theopneustos, which means God breathed, is not the word that was used in the 1st or 2nd century CE to mean inspired. Entheos is the word that was used to mean inspired. Theopneustos, according to the literature from that time period that uses it, was used to mean God breathed, in the sense of God breathed the breath of life into the first human. In other words, these were things that were either given life by God or things that were life-giving to others. So theopneustos is used to refer to streams of water and sandals and even ointments that are used to try to preserve dead bodies for the 3 to 10 days after death, during which period they understood the spirit to be able to potentially return to the body. And so these ointments were supposed to be preserving the lifelike nature of the body in case the spirit returned, so that the person could be revived. And there's a book called The Invention of the Inspired Text by a scholar named John C. Poirier, who shows that in all the places this word is used, there's no single occurrence where it has to mean inspired as we think of the concept. All of the occurrences seem to be using it to mean life-giving, and it's really Origen of Alexandria in the 3rd century CE who first makes the case that we ought to understand this to mean inspiration, in the sense that would have been referred to by the word entheos in the 1st and 2nd century CE. So the text should probably be translated to say all scripture, and again, this is an open-ended category, is life-giving. and is useful for instruction in righteousness and for reproof and all that kind of stuff that it goes on to say. So I think the traditional understanding of that verse is problematic for a number of reasons beyond just the fact that it's definitely not referring specifically to what we know as the Bible.
Excellent. Yeah, it sounds like inspiration in that sense for the ancient Israelites may be different than maybe what most hold today as it being perfect and free from error. Would you agree with that statement or?
I think the idea of inerrancy that we have today is a much more philosophical and a much more worked out doctrine that, wouldn't have a ton of resonance with how they would have understood it. Because you have early Christians who talk about the texts of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament as inspired, but then go on to say, and they disagree on some things here and there, and that's not a big deal.
Mhm.
And so it depends on how people understand the concept of inspiration, and in the ancient world, it that concept would have been understood much differently from the way it is usually understood today by folks who are asserting a doctrine of inerrancy. And even inerrancy there are folks who use it to refer just to inerrancy when it comes to matters of faith or salvation. And then the more expanded sense is the sense that the text is free from error of any kind whatsoever, which I think a lot of early Christians would have objected to.
If inspiration is real, how should we handle the contradictions, changes, and copyist errors we find in manuscripts?
Well, that's the if there is carrying a lot of weight because I think it depends on what you understand inspiration to mean.
Mhm.
And so if you understand it to mean the resulting text must be inerrant, then you don't really have any choice but to retreat to a notion of accommodationism, which is the
Mhm.
idea that God is the one who articulated the text exactly as it was supposed to be, but God decided to make it fit with the understanding of the time and the place and the author and everything like that, which is basically just saying, God did it and God made it sound exactly like this person who, God made it sound like it would have sounded if the person wasn't inspired, which is, well, what makes it inspired then? How do you know that it's inspired if God is like reproducing errors because God knows that this author wasn't incredibly well informed about certain things? Accommodationism, I think, is a slippery doctrine, but I think that's what you have to do if you've decided that this text cannot be errant in any way. Another way to approach it is to think that all that inspiration means is that on the input side of things, it was perfect, but then it passes through the imperfect conduit of the human instrument, and what comes out the other side is not necessarily inerrant. That's another way to think of inspiration that probably aligns a little more with how a lot of ancient followers of Jesus would have understood it, and particularly as they're engaging in some of the problems of transmission of the biblical text, because as the text gets copied and copied and copied, you have a lot of changes being introduced, and your doctrine of inspiration has to include some way to account for transmission,
Mm.
because we don't have any of the original texts, and we can't really say with 100% confidence that we know what the original author actually wrote. The gap that exists between the composition of these texts and our earliest manuscript witnesses to those texts is kind of a black hole. We don't know what went on in there, and there is potential for all kinds of change and alteration, which would fall outside of the scope of inspiration the way a lot of people represent it. And so yeah, that's another complexity to that gets introduced when we're talking about the doctrine of inspiration. So
Mhm.
so I think it depends on what one understands by inspiration, and then once they nail down an exact understanding of inspiration, they've got to deal with the fallout, which in some cases is probably going to be pretty extensive.
Yeah. If we approach the Bible with the idea of inerrancy, do you see any harm, danger, or red flags that would be raised by trying to reconcile some of these items?
I think there are a lot of dangers of doing that, because once we baptize some of these ideologies and these dogmas and say these are God's will, there's potential for all kinds of harm and abuse and violence, because a lot of the text is violent. And a lot of the text is dehumanizing of other groups of people, and a lot of the texts are misogynistic. And you have a pretty clear endorsement of chattel slavery in Leviticus 25, verses 44 through 46. So there are a lot of ways that saying this is God's will, this is inerrant, this is eternal truth, validates and authorizes a lot of phenomenally harmful and hateful and problematic dogmas and ideologies. So I think that's another thing that that folks who assert doctrines of inerrancy have to grapple with. And when it comes to things like slavery, the 19th century is a case study in how to kind of overturn the consensus view regarding what's in the Bible, because you had a lot of people who became opposed to the practice of slavery as a result of the increased salience of abolitionism, who then had to find a way to read that into the Bible. They had to find a way for that to be something that the Bible endorses. And so you see publications of all kinds making these historical and exegetical arguments for how the Bible actually rejects slavery. And like, they're creative, they're well-meaning. I'm glad that they won, but their arguments were wrong. Like, they are renegotiating what they want the Bible to say to overcome something that they realized was morally reprehensible. And there are very similar processes underway, I think, right now when it comes to things like the Bible and homosexuality, LGBTQIA identities. I think we're in the middle of that process of people trying to overturn one of these dogmas that an inerrantist is going to say, well, no, this is the will of God. This is eternal truth. This is the way things are. And you know, at least when it comes to LGBTQIA identities, the Bible has been the root and the cause of untold harm, suffering, abuse, trauma, and even death. You know, to this day, we have children taking their own lives because of the dogmas that people find in the Bible and insist are God's will. And I think that's abhorrent. I think that's an example of the way that these religious ideologies and these dogmas kill.
I couldn't agree more. You touched on it, and I don't want to detour too far down this rabbit hole, but as it relates to slavery, this comes up in dialogue so often. It's a hot topic. Can you briefly describe indentured servitude / debt slavery versus chattel slavery and the differentiation there within the Hebrew text?
Yeah, you have a pretty clear differentiation drawn up in Leviticus 25, because you start in, I think, verse 39, where it talks about how you will not treat your enslaved Israelite harshly. Instead, you will treat them like a day laborer. And this is a reference to debt slavery, and the idea is that if an Israelite falls into debt, they can sell themselves into debt slavery and work off their debt. And this is something that we see in Exodus 21. It's something that we see in Deuteronomy 15. Basically, native Israelites were not subjectable to chattel slavery, but they could be subjected to debt slavery. And in the law codes, it kind of presents it as something that's voluntary. But in the narratives of the Hebrew Bible, it's presented, at least in one instance, as, in some cases, not voluntary. So there's a part where a widow goes to Elisha and says, you know, my husband, who's a prophet, who was a buddy of Elisha's, is dead, and now the creditors are at the door to take my children into slavery. And so it sounds like it was something that was not voluntary in certain instances, but in Leviticus, in Deuteronomy, and Exodus, it is presented as voluntary, at least when it's men, because Exodus also talks about how a man could sell his daughter into debt slavery. And the texts present debt slavery in different ways. According to Exodus, the male debt slave went free in the 7th year. And basically, no matter what the debt was, if somebody went into debt slavery, 6 years of service was what they owed, and then in the 7th year they went free. In Exodus, the female debt slave does not go free, almost certainly because they're basically a sex slave or a concubine. And so going free violates the what the purchaser was trying to get out of the deal, and also they're now damaged goods in the eyes of polite Israelite society. In Deuteronomy, it's still 6 years, and then they go free in the 7th. But Deuteronomy explicitly says the male and the female go free in the 7th year. In Leviticus, it says they go free in the Jubilee year, which occurred every 49 years. And so the question is, does that mean you sign up for 49 years, or does it mean you sign up to be a debt slave until the Jubilee year, whenever that happens to occur? And so if you fall into debt the year after the Jubilee year and go into debt slavery, you got 49 years of debt slavery ahead of you. If you fall into debt and sell yourself into debt slavery the year before the Jubilee year, do you just have 8 months of debt slavery before you go free? The text is not entirely clear, but that is then explicitly distinguished, at least in Leviticus 25, from chattel slavery, where it says, but your slaves, your actual chattel slaves, you will purchase from the nations that are around you and from the foreigners that are dwelling among you. And these you will buy, you will sell, you will pass down as inheritance. You can enslave forever. And this is directly contrasted against the Israelite, who you are not to treat harshly. The foreigner can be a chattel slave. You can treat them, it sounds like, based on Leviticus 25, as harshly as you want. So there is a debt slavery that some people compare to indentured servitude in the Hebrew Bible that's reserved primarily for Israelites, but there is also quite explicitly and quite clearly chattel slavery in the Hebrew Bible that is reserved for the non-Israelite.
Yeah, it seems really interesting to me that there's almost like this hierarchy of humans to go from, human almost down to a property level, from men to women to slaves, etc. As far as the children, like if a slave woman were to have a child, what would happen to that child?
Well, according to Exodus 21, if a woman is sold into debt slavery, the master is usually going to be the one who will be causing any children to be born, in which case they are the property of the master.
Gotcha.
If a man sells himself into debt slavery, if he has a wife, he brings her into the relationship and she leaves with him afterwards. But if the master gives him a wife or a concubine or breeds him, in other words, then all of the children belong to the master. And so one of the ways that people had to increase the number of enslaved folks in their household was you could buy a debt slave and then be like, get to it, make us some kids. And then those children would be enslaved to the master. And the debt slave, when they went free, the wife and the kids, if they were provided by the master, they stay behind. And so the relationships, once they entered into debt slavery, they did take a step down from a position of full legal and moral personhood to something a little closer to being property. In fact, in Exodus 21, it says in one part that if a man beats his enslaved person with a stick and he dies immediately, that enslaved person will be avenged. It doesn't give a clear description of what the vengeance will be, and that's probably because it depends on whether or not it's a native Israelite or a foreigner. But then it says, but if he survives for a day or two, then there will be no punishment. And the idea is, if the beating results in injury that doesn't result in death until a day or two later, then there's no punishment. And the idea there would seem to be the beating was supposed to be instructive or disciplinary and not with the intent to kill, so the death is accidental. And it says there will be no punishment because he was his kesef, which means silver in Hebrew, which means money or property. In other words, they have suffered enough because they have lost their investment, their money, their property, and so there's no punishment for the accidental killing, the manslaughter of that enslaved person. And the text would seem to suggest that that is true whether or not it's an Israelite. In other words, if an Israelite sells himself into debt slavery, they become property, and if they are accidentally killed, there is no punishment. If we're interpreting that in that way. And so there was also a standardized value placed on the life of an enslaved person, and it seems to be whether debt slave or chattel slave, which was 30 shekels.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you have some laws where if an Israelite is gored to death by an ox that got out, and the person who owned the ox had been warned about this, it's the death penalty for the person who owned the ox. If a person's enslaved person is gored by somebody's ox, the owner just has to pay 30 shekels. So the life of the enslaved person has a socially standardized value placed on it, whereas for a full legal and moral person, that's not the case. Their death activates talionic justice, which is the whole eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, life for a life principle. So yeah, you do have this ability to kind of move back and forth between status as a person and status as property.
Interesting. Yeah. Are there translations of the Bible that have softened the term slave or the translation of slave, rendering it closer to servant?
There are a lot of translations that use servant, and there are other translations that have decided to move to using the term slave, and I think that's the correct move. And there's debate because a lot of folks think that if you use slave, folks are going to think of the transatlantic slave trade. They're going to think of American slavery, and the folks who don't like that don't want that connection to be drawn. They're like, but that's not accurate. That's not what's really going on here. And that's not really true. I think the notion of the transatlantic slave trade is closer to what was going on with chattel slavery in the ancient world than the notion of indentured servitude. Because people say, oh, well, they have protections for the rights of the enslaved folks. Same thing is true of the transatlantic slave trade. You can go look up the state codes of like Louisiana in 1825. It's got a section that says, the slave is entirely subject to the will of the master, who may discipline them. Except they cannot maim them or beat them in a way that subjects them to death or something like that. So you have laws on the books in pre-Civil War American South ostensibly protecting the rights of enslaved folks. Now, they were never enforced, so they don't really matter. But when people try to compare biblical slavery to pre-Civil War American South, we have what happened in real life for the South. We overwhelmingly ignore the laws that were on the books. When it comes to the Bible, all we have is the laws that were ostensibly on the books. We don't really know what actually happened in real life. So it's comparing apples to oranges in that regard. But people say, well, it's not race-based. True, because race as a question of skin color is something that was not developed until the late medieval and early modern period in Europe. But the chattel slavery in the Bible is ethnically based. So it's not a huge difference because it's not appropriate for us, it's only appropriate for them. And so whether it's about skin color or language or nationality or something like that, it's still chattel slavery is reserved only for the people who are not like us. And so I think the use of the term slave in English is a much better rendering because there is an awful lot more proximity to the transatlantic slave trade than there is to the notion of indentured servitude. But there's a famous example. I forget which committee it was, but a committee that was responsible for one of the more recent translations of the Bible. There's a video on YouTube of their committee debating whether or not to render doulos in the New Testament in Greek as slave or servant, and I think they side with slave, if I recall. But I think that's the correct decision.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, every time Frank Turek and company jump out with the race-based defense, it's never been satisfactory to me. Comparing those words to what I see in the text, I get the point they're trying to make, but it seems like they're trying to redirect or soften the blow of what the text is actually, especially Leviticus 25:44. I feel like it's kind of redirecting, but that's just my personal opinion. I've always found it surprising that within the Ten Commandments, not covering the slave is even mentioned there rather than having a commandment for thou shalt not own slaves. Is this ever refuted throughout the New Testament? Like, does Jesus ever speak of this? Did the New Testament authors ever retract this slavery idea?
No, in no sense whatsoever. In fact, in the New Testament, you have parables that frame the follower of Jesus, the believer, as an enslaved person. You have the notion that the appropriate relationship of the human to God is one of enslaved to enslaver. You have Paul talking about how you're no longer enslaved to sin, but you're enslaved to God and to Christ. So the slave metaphor is central to the New Testament's representation of our relationship to God, which obviously means that there's something legitimate and valuable about that relationship. So the notion that slavery as a practice itself was ever condemned or even questioned in the Bible is laughable. Now, what you do have in the New Testament is advocacy for better treatment of the enslaved person for followers of Jesus, but you also have advocacy for the followers of Jesus who are enslaved being better enslaved people to their masters. And people want to try to tergiversate. They want to try to twist the notion that masters should be kinder to their enslaved folks into some kind of proto-abolitionism. That, well, once you accept that, there's no way you can accept slavery. Well, ironically, they were happy to accept slavery for over 1,500 years after this was all written, so they didn't get the message. And you have in early Christianity folks like Augustine, who in the bizarre passages says you have to whip your slave. God is angry with you if you do not whip your slave. But when you whip your slave, it cannot be out of anger. It must be with love in your heart. So as long as you got a smile on your face as you're whipping your slave, God is happy with you. And so what exactly it means to be kinder to your enslaved person for a first century CE follower of Jesus is definitely not what a 21st century American imagines is appropriate discipline or treatment of an enslaved person. They have very different ideas of what would have been considered appropriate treatment, and the line that divided appropriate from inappropriate treatment was probably much further down the path than we would want it to be today.
What about the verse that says there's neither male nor female, slave nor free? Does that carry any merit?
That's the Galatians 3:28, which ironically enough, a lot of the folks who will say that, that means that the slavery is bad, will still heartily endorse complementarianism and will still insist that there are fundamental eternal differences between men and women. Which, if they're saying there's Galatians 3:28 means slavery is bad, then Galatians 3:28 must also mean that gender is bad, or at least the distinction in gender is wrong. But you will never find any of those folks insisting that we need to obliterate any difference in gender. They are overwhelmingly complementarian in their orientation. And so, but what most scholars would point out is that the idea is that when it comes to how Jesus sees you and how things will be in the eternities, that's where all of these things are obliterated, not necessarily here on earth. And I think that plays out in the fact that Paul repeatedly acknowledges and asserts differences between male and female, Jew and Gentile, slave and free. So I don't think that verse can be legitimately appealed to as an indication that Paul thought that slavery was bad and that it ought to be obliterated. There are some voices within early Christianity, Gregory of Nyssa, for instance, is one, who make the case that slavery is wrong. They don't call for abolition, but just say this is a bad thing. And they are overwhelmingly in the minority. Like Gregory of Nyssa is the only one I can think of for like the first 5 centuries of Christianity. And it's not until late 15th into the 16th century that you begin to have some Congregationalists and some Quakers who start raising the alarm bells about slavery, and that's kind of the catalyst that causes others to take up the same cause. So there's over 1,000 years of Christians being perfectly happy with slavery that I think put the lie to the notion that the biblical authors were like, they'll get the message, they'll all see that they're supposed to get rid of slavery, because that definitely was not what they were saying.
Mm-hmm. Well, moving on from slavery, in the Gospels, the $1,000,000 question, does Jesus ever actually say the words, I am God, or is that something that our modern eyes are reading back into the text?
Jesus never says that, and I don't think Jesus says anything that suggests that. We do have other entities in the Bible that are not God who do explicitly say, I am God. And so we have a precedent. So Jesus could have said that if Jesus thought that. If we go to Exodus 3, we have Moses on Mount Horeb, and verse 2 says that the angel of the Lord appeared to Moses in a flame of fire in the midst of the burning bush. And 4 verses later, that angel of the Lord says, I am the God of your father, the God of Abram, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And this was supposed to be the angel, not actually God. But you can see that they had the ability to identify as God even if they were not God. Now, you have people who will say, well, Jesus was the angel of the Lord. Excuse me, which is not really, it's not clear in the New Testament apart from maybe the 7th verse of the letter of Jude. But what Jesus does say is that he is the Son of Man and the Son of God, that he has a special relationship with God. The closest you get to the kind of high Christology of Nicene Christianity is probably in the Gospel of John, which begins with logos theology, which is being borrowed from Middle Platonic ideas about how the divine can bridge the gap between the spiritual world of the divine and the fleshly world of matter. And the logos is the divine reason that can become expressed and thus travel out from God. Philo of Alexandria is a Jewish philosopher who treats the word as this logos, as a second God that is able to bridge that gap. And John seems to be picking up on that. In John 1, where he says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and then ke theos, logos is the Greek, and divine was the Word, and the idea there is it's distinguishing the Word from the very God of Israel, but still describing it as divine. I think what you have in John is this notion of Jesus functioning as kind of a divine image, because a divine image manifested the presence of the deity for whatever reason that presence was needed. And so in John 14, Philip says, "Show us the Father," and Jesus says, "Have you been with me so long and haven't realized that if you have seen me, you have seen the Father?" And it's not because Jesus is the Father. The Son is not the Father, even according to Trinitarianism. But the Son manifests the Father, just like a divine image. And I think that's what's going on in John 20, verse 28, when Thomas says, "My Lord and my God." Thomas is not saying Jesus is both my Lord and my God. Thomas is saying, I get it now. You manifest the Father. You are my Lord, and you are manifesting my God, whom I see when I see you. And I think this is because of how Jesus says, I am in the Father, and the Father is in me. We've got this mutual indwelling, and that's what facilitates the oneness that Jesus has with God. And in John 17, the intercessory prayer, Jesus prays that all of his followers become one with him, just as he is one with God, and refers back to the notion of mutual indwelling. Them in me and I in you, that they all may be perfect in one, or perfectly one. So the idea in John is not that Jesus is God, but that Jesus carries and bears and presents God's presence and authority. That's the closest you get to the notion that Jesus is God anywhere, or at least anywhere in the Gospels. I think you may have a reference in like Titus to Jesus as God, but exactly what that means that Jesus is God is not clear. It's certainly not Trinitarian Christianity, but that's also not Jesus claiming to be God. So I don't think you have anything that you could plausibly argue as Jesus claiming to be God. And people will point to John 8:58. I am the saying
Ego
before
eimi.
Abraham was, I am, ego eimi. And I think this fits into the notion that Jesus is functioning kind of as a divine image, because the divine name is most likely what was understood to activate and authorize a divine image, and ego eimi is kind of an encoded reference to the divine name, because the ancient Hebrew echia sher echia from Exodus 3:14, and then also anihu, I am he, from Deuteronomy and Deutero-Isaiah. They're both translated ego eimi in the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation. And so I have argued that Jesus is not saying I am God with this little furtive reference to this encoded divine name. Jesus is saying I possess the divine name. I am the bearer of the divine name, which we see that angel of the Lord who can say, I am God, in Exodus 23, 20 and 21. God says, I'm sending an angel before you to guide you along the way. Don't disobey him. Don't tick him off, because he does not have to forgive your sins, because my name is in him, which I think is representing the angel as authorized by the divine name. And you see this idea reflected in a handful of other texts where an angel like Yahuel in the Apocalypse of Abraham says that they're authorized by the divine name that God has put in them. And so I think that's what's going on there in John. It's a much more kind of complex Second Temple Greco-Roman period Jewish idea of divine mediation and divine imagery that all gets kind of brought together in the tradition of Jesus, and people want to reduce it down to something simple and philosophical, and that's what gave rise over the next couple centuries to the idea of the Trinity.
Mm-hmm. Man, there's so many things that you rattled off there that I would love to unpack.
I'm a rambler.
Oh, it's
Yeah.
I'm the same way. But when it comes to John, me personally, when I read John and looking at the Christology, I think it's super fascinating how there's like, it's hard for me to pinpoint, even though I can see that it has probably the highest Christology of all the Gospels. At the same time, you get other statements that clearly show distinction. There, I've heard that there's different authors within John. Is that what I'm reading? Is that one is from one author, one is from the other author?
Well, there are scholars who think that the prologue, the Logos hymn at the beginning of John, might be from another author, might pre-exist the Gospel. There's a wonderful new book out called The Gospel of John: A New History by Hugo Mendez, and he makes a good case, I think, that there's only one author. Apart from the fact that chapter 21 is probably entirely secondary. That's probably a later addition to the original composition, and then the story of the woman taken in adultery is also added secondarily. But what he argues is that this might be just kind of a poetic introduction that the author is providing because there's so much in the Gospel of John that seems to be directly contingent upon the Logos ideology,
Mhm.
even though Jesus is not necessarily labeled the Logos anywhere else in the Gospel of John. So there are certainly scholars who argue that, but the um, I think the best case to make is for a unified authorship, at least everything apart from chapter 21 and the story of the woman taken in adultery.
Mhm. When we hear the phrase like the Father and I are one, uh, isn't there a reference that kind of puts that same relationship to us as the general people to God as well? And wouldn't that
Well,
make
yeah,
us gods?
that's what's in chapter 17, the intercessory prayer, where 3 times Jesus prays that his followers become one with him just like he is one with the Father.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, it would suggest if you understand Jesus's oneness with God to mean consubstantiality, the Trinity, then yeah, the intercessory prayer is praying that Jesus's followers all become part of the Trinity, that they all become co-equal, co-eternal, consubstantial persons of the one being of God. But I think you see in John 1:12, it says that Jesus gave them, his followers, power to become the children of God. And I think this is a type of divinization, theosis, or deification, the idea that soteriology, the salvation that is preached in the Gospel of John, is basically deification through this mutual indwelling. So I think it's kind of a mystical soteriology that you see. But yeah, absolutely. I think the Gospel of John suggests that whatever that oneness is that Jesus has with God, that's going to be democratized to all of Jesus's followers.
Mhm. And I believe Jesus even quotes something from the Old Testament to the scribes, telling them, "Aren't we all sons of God?"
So he quotes Psalm 82. They come to him and say, "You, they're going to stone him," and he says, "For which of my deeds are you stoning me?" And they said, "It's not for something you did. It's you being a human. Try to make yourself divine." And he says, "But doesn't it say in your own law that I said you are gods and all of you children of the Most High?" And this is Psalm 82. And Jesus says, if those to whom the word of God came are called gods, why are you giving me a hard time for saying I'm the son of God? And I think this is based on a conventional approach to Psalm 82 from that time period that read Psalm 82 as a reference to the Israelites at Sinai. And so when it says those to whom the word of God came, what it means is the Israelites who received the law were freed from the power of death and basically made immortal, made gods. And Jesus is the word itself. So Jesus is kind of saying, I've got much more right to the title Son of God than these folks because I'm the Word made flesh. And so I think the argument there is just there's nothing wrong with claiming divinity because that's in the scriptures, and I'm here to make that a reality for all of my followers, which is what I think we see in John 1:12 and also what I think we see in John 17.
Mhm. Yeah, I wanna touch on something right there. You mentioned
Mhm.
claiming divinity. In my experience, I feel like there's a lot of terms that get thrown around that most Christians assume they mean one thing, and it's probably more nuanced than just the high level look they're giving it. Terms like Lord,
Mhm.
Messiah, as well as angel of God. Sometimes like angel of God is in the burning bush rather than what I used to think as a kid was actually Yahweh speaking through the bush. So sometimes I've interpreted that as the Holy Spirit. So can you unpack some of those terms and how we should interpret them, how they're used differently throughout Scripture?
Well, I think the concept of the angel of the Lord or the angel of God from the Hebrew Bible is actually a product of textual interpolation, because I think the stories like Exodus 3,
Hmm.
as well as Genesis 16 with Hagar, Genesis 22 with Abraham, Judges 6 with Gideon, Judges 13 with Manoach and his wife. Elsewhere, the stories that involve the angel of Adonai, they seem to go back and forth between identifying the angel as either the angel or God themselves. And what I've argued in my book, Adonai's Divine Images, is that this makes the most sense. But if we understand these stories to originally have been about God themselves interacting with humanity, and then an editor sometime later on coming through and adding the word angel in order to obscure the identity of this divine figure and distance God somewhat from humanity.
Mm-hmm.
And the ambiguity, I think, is helpful because it makes it too squishy to really get a grip on. You can't really say precisely what's going on here.
Mm-hmm.
So this gets picked up in by the authors of the New Testament, who are talking about, for instance, Gabriel coming to the Annunciation with Mary and things like that. And you have the do not be afraid stuff. Now, in the Hebrew Bible, they were saying do not be afraid because you weren't supposed to be able to see God's face and live.
Mm-hmm.
So the people who are responding to the visit from God, in the narrative, they know this is God. It's only the later textual corruption that turns it into the angel. There's no reason for anybody to fear seeing the face of an angel, but they're afraid of seeing God. And so the New Testament authors only know this as the angel, and so they present these other angels, Gabriel, for instance, as popping up and people going, I'm going to die. And they have to say, do not fear. So you have an evolution in these figures and their roles, their identities, and how people are responding to them. And so angels just generic angels in the Hebrew Bible would have been understood as divine beings, as gods, but they're basically messenger gods. They're the third tier kind of servile deities. And I think they might actually be secondary to the development of the concept of the angel of the Lord. I'm still mulling that over. But by the time you get to the New Testament, you've crossed through Greco-Roman period Judaism, which is where you have this literary explosion of all kinds of different figures, and they're all hierarchized, and they're named, and they're given jobs, and all this kind of stuff. And there's a wonderful book by Annette Yoshiko Reed called Demons, Angels, and Writing in Ancient Judaism, which talks about how the fact that the democratization of writing as a result of the spread of the alphabet in the Hellenistic period resulted in a lot more literary exploration of the heavens, and so you had a lot of development of these different figures, which is largely attributable to Greek. So the New Testament is imagining a heavens that is heavily informed not only by Greek mythology but also by the kind of contemplation of the heavens on the part of Greco-Roman Jewish authors. And so the characters are very different from what we have in the Hebrew Bible. Everybody is turned into an angel or a demon, basically, by the time we get to the New Testament.
Mm-hmm. For the other terms like Lord and Messiah, and then even the Son of Man, I think it's several times, even like Ezekiel's referred to the Son of Man. When I was growing up, all those terms meant God, the Almighty. So how can we decipher as lay readers without scholarly background when the word means God and when the word means king or master?
Yeah. Excuse me. That's an interesting evolution because Son of Man would just be Ben Adam or Bar Enosh in Aramaic, which would have been in the Hebrew and Aramaic traditions just a way to refer to a member of the human race, because you could refer to a member of the group by saying a son or a daughter of that group. So you have son of the prophets, son of God, son of man. These are ways to refer to members of that group. So when God is calling Ezekiel Ben Adam, God is saying, hey, mortal. God is distinguishing themselves from this non-immortal entity. Now, when you get into Daniel 7 and you have the vision is of one like a bar enosh, like a son of man, which means somebody who looked human. But when that gets translated into Greek, it seems to become more of a title. And the description of this entity as like a human in appearance, becomes a title, Son of Man. And so by the time you get to the New Testament, this is now apparently a title. And the history of the interpretation of Daniel 7 suggests that Son of Man was an even more divine title than Son of God, because you have this interesting variant reading where the Son of Man comes to the Ancient of Days in the Aramaic and in some of the Greek, but there are versions of the Greek where the preposition hos, or the preposition heos, which is the to the Son of Man, is changed to hos. And so what it's saying is the Son of Man came as the Ancient of Days, which would seem to suggest that the Son of Man could manifest as God or be God. And so Son of Man was a more divine title. This was somebody who represented God. And in my scholarship, I've argued that this was rationalized as the Son of Man being kind of like a divine image, as they were authorized to bear the divine name, and therefore divine power, authority, presence went with them. So wherever they were, the divine presence, power, and authority was. And so to say Jesus is the Son of Man is a far more divine within first century CE Jewish understanding. To say they were the Son of Man was more divine than saying they were the Son of God, because they were in a world where there were lots of emperors, and humans were identified as offspring or sons of God, usually in the sense of adopted by. They are the representative of God. They are the Son of God. And so that was a more kind of secular, might not be the best term for it, but it was kind of a broader term that didn't carry with it the divine freight that the Son of Man title did, which, changed from just a way to refer to a mortal into the title of an entity who bore God's presence.
Interesting. How do passages like John 1:1 or Philippians 2 shape Christians' claims about Jesus' divinity compared to, say, that of Mark's gospel?
Well, I think you have a few different things to consider. Like Philippians 2 is one of the earliest Christian texts, long pre-existed the Gospels. So if you understand that to be talking about Jesus's pre-existence and Jesus's identity with God, then you have an argument that understanding, that high Christology, goes all the way back to the earliest years of Christianity. John 1:1 is probably from 90 to 110 CE, somewhere in there. So that's much later, but it's a much more philosophically informed kind of high Christology. So it certainly contributes to the notion that there's some sense in which Jesus is divine and has a special relationship with God. But the algebra equation that needs to be solved is precisely how. To say that Jesus is God all by itself doesn't say much. The question is, how can Jesus be God? And that's the question that I think we need to look into the literature and the ideologies around the first century to answer, rather than go to the later developed philosophical frameworks of primarily Nicene Trinitarianism. So I think people who appeal to those passages to say, see, it's the Trinity, are committing an anachronism. They're retrojecting a specific philosophical answer, a specific way to solve for X in that algebra equation that didn't exist when these texts were written and would not exist until a couple centuries later. And so I think we are on much firmer ground by searching for the answers that did exist and would have been available to these folks in the time periods when these texts were written. And I think that the best answer is the idea of divine images, that Jesus would have been seen as manifesting God's presence as an authorized bearer of the divine name.
Yeah, I've always felt like the applying the Trinity back to Genesis. It seems like a seems like a retrofit to me. So I think
Yeah.
that's kind of the similar thing that you're mentioning there. Uh, in Mark's gospel, it seems that Jesus's divinity, or more of an adoption type, I guess, Christology, if you will, versus something that was the beginning and the end. In the beginning was the Word, like we get in John.
Mhm.
They seem to have different ideas, different theologies. What do you think about that?
I think those are different ways to solve for x in that algebra problem. And I think there's a good case to make that Mark seems to present, or at least to prioritize, an adoptionist Christology, where Jesus seems to have been adopted by God at his baptism. Um, Paul seems to be incorporating a couple different Christological frameworks. There's a wonderful scholar named Alexei Chadziadoniu who recently recently published an article arguing for image Christology. Paul's iconic Christ is what he talks
Hmm.
about. How he does refer to Jesus as an image, and that ought to be understood in the sense of a divine image. But Paul has other ideas as well, and seems to, in some sense, understand Jesus to pre-exist his birth. John is borrowing from the Middle Platonic Logos doctrine, but also, in my opinion, seems to be overlaying that with this idea of Jesus as, in some sense, divine image.
Hmm.
So I think they're all reaching for the available frameworks for how to understand and represent Jesus as, in some sense, divine, and in some sense having some kind of unique relationship to God. But because there are a variety of different ways to solve for x, there's no one single way that they're all using, and it wouldn't all be reduced down to one single answer until you get to Nicaea and Chalcedon and after. So I think it's really different ways to solve for x in the algebra equation of how Jesus can be doing the things that only God was supposed to be able to do, and how Jesus can be asserting the titles that are supposed to be God's titles.
If I think you touched on this briefly earlier, if Paul calls Jesus God in places, does that mean that the earliest Christians already saw him as divine, or was that a later developed idea?
I think it suggests that they understood him in some sense to bear some kind of divinity, and I think Paul suggests there's a divinity to Christ, but I I also think that it's very common to treat divinity and humanity as a binary, as if you're 100% one or 100% the other. And I don't think that's accurate. I think there's been a lot of good scholarship. Michael Peppert's book, The Son of God in the Roman World, for instance, is a good example of this. Um, uh, there was a notion in this time period of a spectrum between deity and humanity, where the center of that spectrum, there was a lot of overlap, and you have divine humans and human deities and things like that. And so I think Jesus was certainly understood to be operating somewhere in the middle of that spectrum, but certainly not yet Jesus was God. That's something you don't get until after the New Testament was written. But I think probably the earliest generations of followers of Jesus did understand Jesus to be, in some sense, divine.
How did the doctrine of Jesus' divinity become central to Christianity? Was it settled quickly, or did it take the centuries of debate?
No, it took centuries of debate. There were ideas already by the time you get to the second century apologists about Jesus as God. But I think the key to all of that was the fact that what the apologists and later Christians were trying to do was spread Christianity throughout the Greco-Roman world. And in order to do that, they needed to make it palatable to the Greco-Roman intelligentsia. They needed to make it philosophically sophisticated and defensible, which meant they needed to come up with a way to suggest that what we have here with Jesus fits into your worldview. In fact, it is the fulfillment of everything that you've been looking for. And so what they were trying to do was basically create a vision of Jesus that lined up with the conventional wisdom of the Greco-Roman world. And that is why you have people borrowing from Middle Platonic logos doctrines. That is why you have ideas about divine emanations and things like that. That is why you develop the doctrine of the Trinity using Greek philosophical frameworks, because you're basically accommodating Christianity to Greek philosophy and saying, see, we are the fulfillment of everything that you've been looking for. That was the most profitable kind of pitch that they could make to the Greco-Roman world, and that's what I think allowed Christianity to take over the Roman Empire, was the fact that it was something that could be accommodated to the Greco-Roman philosophical worldview. Now, after that happens, philosophy continues to change and develop, and Christianity has to constantly be trying to renegotiate the relationship of Jesus to the prevailing views about what is right and what is good and all that kind of stuff. So that's why we see people today arguing about slavery and the cosmological argument and fine tuning and all this. It is Christianity continuing to have to renew and remake the case that we are everything that you are looking for, and everything that we know is true about the world. Christianity is the fulfillment of that, and it's a case that's going to have to continually be renewed and remade every single generation as our understanding of the world around us changes and develops. And Christianity is always going to want to be there to say, see, that's where we belong. And that starts, I think, in the middle of the 2nd century with the apologists.
Absolutely. Something that's always struck me odd is looking at Shema and Deuteronomy and then seeing how we get from there to something, say, like in Paul's 1 Corinthians 8:6. How do we get from one place to another, and when did that actually occur?
I think the Shema is not a question of how many gods there are. It's really an assertion of how many Adonais there are. And I've we talked about this on a recent episode of the Data Over Dogma podcast, where the Hebrew there, Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, the closest correlations to that in elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible are places like Song of Songs 6:9, where it says my dove and my perfect one is one, and she is one to her mother. And the idea there is not that she's the only woman that exists, it's that she's the only woman for me. So it's a matter of exclusive relationships rather than exclusive existence. And so the Shema, as Nathan MacDonald argued in Deuteronomy and the Meaning of Monotheism, is primarily about demanding exclusive allegiance. And I think that's obviously what's going on in the one God rhetoric of Deutero-Isaiah, of exilic and post-exilic literature. And I think getting down into the New Testament, it's a lot of the same. Now, the idea that God is further and further exalted above all the other gods till it gets to the point that God is the one, from a Platonic point of view, God is superlative, and there can only be one superlative. And so that must be the God of Israel, and all other gods are only divine by participation, or they're honorarily called gods, or they are subordinate deities or something like that. And we get down to Paul who tries to kind of renegotiate the Shema and incorporate Jesus into it, because we have a reference to God and Lord, and just like Thomas as my Lord and my God, Paul is kind of dividing the two up and saying we've got the Lord and the God included in this understanding of Jesus as kind of the divine vice regent or something like that, the representative of God who is so unified with God that he's basically just an extension of God. And I think you have one God rhetoric in the New Testament. I don't think you have what we call monotheism until well after that. I think that's a later developed philosophical framework that required the doctrine of creation ex nihilo, because there were a lot of debates about the morality of eternal matter. Because if matter is just as eternal as God, then there's something distinct from God that God is not responsible for, and
Mhm.
to which, and that is not contingent upon God. And that's something that is considered unacceptable by Christians. And so by the end of the 2nd century CE, we have the development of the doctrine of creation ex nihilo, and monotheism has always relied on the notion of creation ex nihilo because that's so important to God's absolute sovereignty, that there is nothing that exists independent of God. So I don't think you have what we understand as monotheism anywhere in the Bible, although you certainly have one God rhetoric, which again is primarily about demanding exclusive allegiance rather than asserting exclusive existence.
Mhm. And you have a whole chapter dedicated to something out of nothing. I found that
Hmm.
really interesting, and we're barely skimming the surface of it, but a lot you unpacked there. I really enjoyed that.
Good.
One thing when I read the scholarship on this, your book as well as others, you know, I like to consider myself pretty knowledgeable for a layperson without any
Hmm.
schooling for it. But at the same time, when I see how in-depth scholars get, I mean, breaking things down by the letter, it just blows my mind. It just makes me feel like a little ant. How should we as non how should we as non-scholars approach the text? Do you have any advice for improving our hermeneutics when we read?
I think it is a good idea to try to get it as informed as you can, but unless you're able to engage the source texts in their original languages on a very detailed level, you should be able to acknowledge that ultimately you're going to be punting to the experts who are translating it for you, who are explaining it for you, who are telling you what the right interpretation is. That's kind of an inevitability. At some point, we have to acknowledge that we're borrowing our understanding from other folks, and so that requires a little bit of hermeneutic humility. And scholars have to do the same, because as much as we might be experts on certain issues, we always have to rely on the expertise of others, because we're always going to be incorporating stuff from beyond the scope of our particular expertise. And so while some people might feel like that's me saying, you have to listen to me, the reality is that every scholar listens to other scholars.
Mhm.
And all scholars have to practice the same kind of hermeneutical humility as well. And that's one of the reasons I think it's problematic for people to get out there and just rail on the internet about how it means this, that, and the other, because ultimately we can trace their arguments back to some expert or even non-expert who said it and they just accepted it. They didn't have the skills or the resources to be able to interrogate the claim, but they just accepted it arbitrarily. And so that is underlying pretty much all non-expert analysis that we see on social media. And that's one of the reasons I'm on social media, is because I want to try to represent the academic side of it and say, for those of you who are not experts and cannot interrogate the merits of these arguments, I want to try to provide something from hopefully a trusted source who can say, to the best of my ability to interrogate these claims, this is what the experts are saying. And so a lot of there are an awful lot of people out there who will say, all I need is the Spirit.
Mhm.
And they won't listen to a word I say
Mhm.
because I don't have the Spirit.
Sure.
They have the Spirit, and so whatever they come up with is the truth. And I kind of have to laugh at that, because there have been times in the past where I've shared photos of either ancient Greek New Testament manuscripts or manuscripts from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it's been like, what does the Spirit tell you this says? Guess what? You have absolutely no idea, because you are always going to be relying on somebody else's interpretation or
Mhm.
translation. You're going to have to rely on that. And there's a similar claim that you don't need a PhD to understand the Bible. You don't maybe need a PhD, but you are always going to rely on somebody who had a
Yeah.
PhD, because you can't access it unless you have if not a PhD, at least a PhD level of training and expertise on those things. So, as unpopular as it sounds for a lot of
Yeah.
people, at some point you're going to be relying on the opinion of experts. And my advice would just be to interrogate those experts and find the experts that you can rely on, not because they say what you want to hear, but because they're doing the best job. And that's a difficult thing to do.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, on my own personal journey, I feel like I stumbled to that conclusion on my own, and it was
Uh,
super humbling and also scary at the same time. So I can only imagine what others are feeling when they get down that road. It's definitely a rabbit hole. The more you study, the more you
yeah,
realize you don't have a clue,
yeah.
or at least to pinpoint it to absolute certainty. But I will say this: one thing I love about you, Dan, is how fair you are. And I know there's going to be people that comment here as well as on your video that will disagree. But even reading your book, hearing you on your podcast and whatnot, you present the other scholarship that you may even disagree with a lot. So you'll lay out both sides, or consensus here, consensus there, whether you agree with it or not. And I just think that's extremely valuable. I think this is one space where it's extremely difficult to not pull in your bias. And I think you do a really great job of walking that line, and furthermore, I wouldn't even call it walking the line. I think you're clearly on the side of providing the scholarship rather than your personal opinion. Although I do appreciate when we do get a little bit of your opinion here and there. I think that helps people with their own journey.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah. I believe one of religion's goals was unity. However, somewhere along the way, it has created division. We're 2,000 years removed from Christ's ministry. In your opinion, what appears to be the best path back to unity amongst the human race, or are we bound to be divided forever with our theology and ideas?
Um, that's a difficult question, but I think unity, there's a degree to which uh, the key to the flourishing of human civilization has been empathy.
Mhm,
But empathy can have a scope built into it, because we have what's called parochial empathy, which is what cognitive scientists and anthropologists would identify as empathy for the in-group that is antagonistic toward the out-group.
mhm,
But empathy can expand beyond that scope, and we can have global empathy, which is where your empathy extends beyond the in-group to the out-group. And there's a lot of intersectionality, and there are a lot of different social identities that reify a lot of different boundaries and in and out groups. So, I can have within my own household, there I and my children and my wife share a number of social identities where they're all part of my in-group, but there are other ways that they have other identities that would be an out-group from me. And so the ability to extend the scope of one's empathy beyond their own social identities to include the out-groups, I think, is the key to unity. But that requires an awful lot of humility and compromise, because to extend that empathy to the out-group means to not get what you want every time,
mhm,
and to allow for concessions for members of the out-group. And that's a hard thing to do. It's not just a win-win every single time, but when you are able to extend that empathy, what you do is bring more people into the fold, into the in-group, and they become part of the in-group, and that is what allowed humans to increase the size of their in-groups beyond, for instance, Dunbar's number, which is this idea that there are only about 150 people that you could really ever personally know
right.
well enough to be considered a friend.
Mhm,
Extend empathy is required to extend, and the kind of social mechanisms and institutions that facilitate that empathy, that allowed human civilizations to grow increasingly large and increasingly complex without breaking down because of conflict.
mhm,
So To the degree that religion is about unity, I think a religion ought to be about ways to facilitate empathy and facilitate its expansion beyond the perception of our in-group. And that is easier said than done. I think you see shades of that in
Mm-hmm.
the New Testament. You know,
Mm-hmm.
the parable of the Good Samaritan is a good example, I think, of precisely that. Who is my neighbor? Well, the one who is able to extend the scope of their empathy beyond the in-group. I think that would be what I would hope we would focus on. Unfortunately, to the degree that religion is about access to power and resources, it becomes about conflict and contest, and it
Mm-hmm.
becomes a zero-sum game for a lot of folks who are out there not necessarily to ensure just that they have access to power and resources, but to ensure that others are denied that access. And I think that is that's the parochial empathy that says, no, my empathy is staying right here. It's not going any
Yeah.
further. And that's what I think is damaging.
I think that's well said. You know, when I was spending days in the pews, I felt like
Hmm.
that was clearly the case, was this unity, the acceptance of the outgroup. But the more that I've personally zoomed out in my faith walk, the more that line starts to blur between unity and division. And I want to move towards something personally, exactly what you said, where we're starting to create more unity, and I don't know what that looks like. You know, I personally left the Christian faith myself about 5 years ago, but
Uh-huh.
it's really hard for me to find a replacement to the community that I had within church. The
Yeah.
the services. I mean, sure, there's volunteer work and there's, you know, places that gather, but there is something different about, at least in the South, mainly Protestant areas. There's others, but just that community, the togetherness, the charity, the praying, the support. It's just, I don't know. But as I zoomed out, I started to see that maybe my glasses were a little rosy when I was sitting in the pews. I'm able to
Hmm.
see a broader picture now that I was I guess I was too tunnel visioned on what was important to me, that I never took the time to look around and see the world and other denominations for what they believed and how that contradicted with my own theology. So
Hmm.
yeah, it gets really tough to navigate that. For me, where I'm at. And it's one of the goals I hope to come
Yeah.
out of this channel. I want to give people a safe spot to ask questions and to kind of lean into each other and learn from each other. I think that's how we can progress as well, as, learning from each other and hearing other people's opinions and humbling
Yeah.
ourselves to those opinions at time instead of just getting back at them.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things I hear the most from people who have deconstructed, who have left religion behind, is that they miss the community, because that is, I think, scratching an intuitive itch, and that is one of the
Hmm.
ingredients to greater empathy. And there's not a ton that can replace that. And there's some research, not enough, but there's some research within the cognitive science of religion that suggests that what we have labeled religion is able to provide a sense of community that, to up until now, the only thing that has been able to reproduce the outcomes of that sense of community are smaller democratic societies with strong social safety nets.
Hmm.
Those are able to reproduce the outcomes of the good outcomes that religion produces.
Hmm.
But those are not things you can just have shipped to you.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's difficult to produce, and particularly when a lot of people's identities are built upon the rejection of small democratic societies with strong social safety nets.
Hmm.
So it's a struggle.
Yeah. It most certainly is. What was the first biblical item or concept that made you question or think deeper about all of this? Because I'd assume, I'm making an assumption here, but you probably grew up as a believer, and at one point you're like, whoa, what was kind of the first thing that kind of made you take a step back and say, there's more to this?
Well, I didn't grow up as a believer. I was born into a fundamentalist Christian commune in the mountains of West Virginia, but we left when I was like 6 years old. I remember nothing about it, and I was kind of raised a-religious, if not agnostic.
Hmm.
However, I do remember the first time I looked at a Bible. I was probably 11 or 12 years old. I was stuck in a church for like an hour while my mom was doing rehearsals because she was participating in a community production of a nativity something.
Mhm.
And so I was sitting in pews, bored out of my mind for like an hour, and I was like, "Well, there's a Bible. Let me read some of this." And I remember one of the first things I did was I started at the beginning and was like, "This is dumb," and I'm flipping through. I'm read a page or two here or there, and I get to Exodus 6, and there God is introducing themselves to Moses, and God says, um. I was known to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as El Shaddai, but by my name, the Lord, Adonai, I was not known to them.
Mhm.
And I was like, wait a minute. I distinctly remember seeing that small caps Lord in many places in the previous book in Genesis. And I went back, and sure enough, you have Abraham. God visits Abraham and says, I am the Lord, I am Adonai, introducing themselves to Abraham quite explicitly as Adonai.
Mhm.
And the same is true of Isaac, the same is true of Jacob. And I was like, but they here he says, no, they didn't know my name,
Yeah.
the Lord. And I was like, and that's not even a name, that's a title. And so the very first time I read the Bible, I was like, this doesn't make any sense.
Wow.
And so my first impression of the Bible was that it seemed to contradict itself. But at the same time, I was like, this is as far from my understanding, this is kind of the literary foundation of the Western world. So there's got to be a way to make sense of this. There's got to be a way they
Sure.
have found to make sense of this. And so, yeah, I would say that my very first encounter with the Bible left me baffled. And that has kind of been that's been the interpretive lens that has informed my engagement ever since.
I find that extremely fascinating. It probably took me 10 years before I started, seeing things like that pop up. So that's a incredible experience for that to be the first time you picked it up. Uh,
Well, I didn't know the traditions. I didn't know how
mhm.
you were supposed to read the Bible.
Sure.
I didn't know what presuppositions and what theological outlooks I was supposed to have. So I think that's the danger of somebody going to the Bible without any training, is that those things are immediately going to pop up. But if you're raised to know the story of Noah before you can even
Sure.
read
Mhm.
the chapter in Genesis, you already have those lenses.
Mhm.
They're already baked in, and so you already know how to approach it. So I think that was just an artifact of the fact that I was an ignorant reader coming to the text without
Mhm.
any idea how I was supposed to approach it.
Mhm. And for me, I was never really a fundamentalist, but being around a lot, we're as a kid, you're told what the Bible says, whether it's Sunday school, in church, your parents. And then when I started doing my due diligence and reading it for myself and seeing that a lot of the
Hmm.
things I was seeing in the text didn't quite align with what I was being told, that's one of the first things that started to give me pause and make me think a little bit deeper about the situation. And some of them hold up, but some of them, I just found the apologetic answers unsatisfactory on several
Hmm.
topics. Um, and I guess that can bring us into our next question. This was one of them for me that I struggle with personally. But do any of the omni properties typically associated with Adonai hold up?
No. No, they are all philosophical innovations, and while some of them pop up in the more philosophically oriented layers of the Bible, whether the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament, there are always passages that conflict with them.
Hmm.
So God's omnipotence. I've talked many times about 2 Kings chapter 3, where God is defeated by the patron deity of the nation of Moab, and has to retreat, and the prophecy that was promised through Elisha fails. So God is not omnipotent according to multiple parts of the Bible. God is not omniscient according to multiple parts of the Bible. God is asking questions. God is changing their mind. God is regretting things. God is not sure where Adam is. God needs to go down to see what the people building the Tower of Babel, or to see what the people who are the inhabitants of Sodom are doing. God needs to verify stuff. So omniscience is not everywhere. And omnipresence is certainly not everywhere. You have people leaving and entering God's presence. You have God's presence leaving places. You have God needing to travel. Let us go down and see what they're doing at Babel. I need to go into Sodom to see what they're doing. Those are all philosophical superlatives that develop over time as you kind of have to, the constant one-upping and competition between the different deities leads ultimately to somebody finally saying, well, God is absolute superlative regarding this, that, and the other, and those are the three that, and well, the four that are probably the most common are omnipotence, omnipresence, omniscience, and then omnibenevolence, which is also something that I think is problematic in the Bible, because you have a God who lies, you have a God who kills arbitrarily, you have a God who does all kinds of things we now recognize as immoral. So, those are all philosophical constructs that are that many authors of the Bible either rejected or were ignorant of when they were writing their stories about God.
Yeah, I remember the flood narrative. You know, the regret there, as well as 1 Kings 22. Those were, when I read those with adult eyes, I was like, hold up. So I think those were two of the first dominoes for me on the omnis. And then I started really going back through the Hebrew text and seeing a lot of the malevolence that occurs there. So that was really challenging for me. So to help our listeners, what's the best version of the Bible that you would recommend for readability as well as accuracy?
I think the updated edition of the New Revised Standard Version is the one I prefer. And right now, the edition I would recommend is the SBL Study Bible, because there are a lot of great introductions to each book of the Bible, a lot of great explanatory notes. They even have little mini essay sidebars scattered around the text, addressing a bunch of different topics. And I even wrote one of them. That's there at Exodus 3. I was tickled by that. I didn't know that was going to happen until somebody was like, "Hey, you're in the Bible." But there's also the New Oxford Annotated Bible. There's a fourth or fifth. Good grief! No, I think it's the fifth edition.
Yeah, I think that's right.
The fifth edition right now has not yet incorporated the updated edition of the NRSV, but that will happen within the next year or two. That they'll publish the next edition that will have the NRSV UE, and I will probably recommend that one once that is published, because they also tend to do a phenomenal job, and they have thematic essays in the back that I think are really helpful as well.
Excellent. If you could be any superhero, Dan, which one would you be and why?
I would hate to be a superhero because of the responsibility and the pressure, and because I would have to be exposed every day to some of the worst of humanity and living in the world that we live in. However, I think I would want to be Superman, although that's not my favorite superhero. I think that's the one that I would enjoy being the most, and I think resonates most closely with my own particular worldview and character. My favorite superhero is Wolverine, and that is the last superhero I would want to be, because of how much awful stuff Wolverine has seen, and how much awful stuff Wolverine is responsible for. So, but yeah, I think Superman would be the one.
Yeah, awesome. I feel like you've been asked that question before, the way you answered it so confidently. If you could Thanos snap one dogma and it instantly be gone from the world, which dogma would it be?
Oh gosh, there are a lot of them, but I think because of how much I talk about it on social media, I think the one that is most pervasive and most subtle, and that most people are not even aware of, would be the presupposition of univocality. That's the one that I would get rid of.
Absolutely. I think I could agree with you there. One thing that I'll mention about your book too, is I love your personality that's inserted outside of the scholarship. So, your
Hmm.
references to pop culture, the way you sign off your introduction, you make a claim and then you hold yourself to the flame. So I appreciate that. So
Uh-huh.
I love just that artistic touch. I recognize it. I appreciate
Oh,
it.
thank you.
With that being said, one that popped up several times, I wanted to ask you, what's your favorite Pearl Jam song?
Oh gosh. There are that's a tough one. I really like Better Man.
Mhm.
I wish I could sing along with Yellow Ledbetter, but nobody can.
Yeah, that's
I
true.
think Jeremy is a phenomenal one, and then Eddie Vedder's got some good
Yeah, it sure
solo
does.
songs that I like. He's got there's one called Society.
Mhm.
That is a very interesting folk song that he's recorded, and yeah, there are a handful of others, but yeah, I think those would be the ones I at least from where I stand right now, those are the ones that I think I appreciate the most in this moment.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, those are all great ones. Have you seen the movie Into the Wild?
I think that's the soundtrack that Eddie has
Yeah,
a lot of. I'm aware of the movie. I have not watched the movie, but
fantastic.
is it?
Yeah, I highly recommend it.
Yeah.
If you like
Okay.
the outdoors and you like Pearl Jam, and it's sad, but I think you would appreciate it a lot.
Yeah,
It's really
I
good.
know the story,
Mhm.
but yeah, I'll have to check out the movie then,
I own
because
it,
I
so
can imagine some of that music would complement and the story quite well.
mhm. Do you have any book recommendations? I know you spouted off a lot. I'll put in the link and in the descriptions everything you cited today so people can know those resources. But are there any other books
Hmm.
if people are trying to learn more, they want some supplementary literature? Whether that's Ugaritic text or understanding ancient Israel or whatever it may be, what would you recommend to maybe in a couple of different those areas?
Oh gosh, well there are so many different areas that you could be
Hmm.
looking into, and there are texts that I think of differing degrees of accessibility as well. Um, oh, that's a difficult one. Uh, There are I really like an awful lot of commentaries. If people are wanting to know about individual books of the Bible, the four commentaries I usually recommend are Hermenea, the Anchor Yale Bible Commentary Series, Old Testament Library and New Testament Library, and then the International Critical Commentary Series. the Yeah, there's just too much for
Yeah.
me to whittle it down to a couple of books from a few different topics. But what I would say is, um, if you're wanting to know about particular themes related to the Bible, I would get on scholar.google.com and search for like the broadest way to describe the theme you're looking for, and then find the books that were published within the last 20 years or so and look for publishers like Oxford, like Cambridge. Usually university presses are going to be very good, and you'll usually be able to find texts that are written by reputable scholars that are going to be great representations of where the scholarship stands on that at any given time. But I'm gonna have to make a list of like 5 or 10. Like here's kind of a scattershot intro to Bible books that I would recommend, but unfortunately I can't think any of off the top of my head right now. Sorry.
That's fair. I'm sure you've read thousands of them. But if by chance you can come up with some before I release this, email them to me. I'll try to throw them in the description for these guys. Um,
Okay.
can you provide a brief summary of what we've covered today? Maybe just some key takeaways that you would encourage our listeners, as well as maybe where we can find your books and find you.
Well, I'm all over the internet these days, much to the chagrin of my enemies. Uh, I don't have enemies, but I would say, yeah, I'm at McClellan, McLellan, on TikTok, on Instagram, on YouTube, on X or Twitter, and at McClellan.org. I have online classes that I've done. I've got 2 parts of an Introduction to Biblical Hebrew course that is available there. As well, the Data Over Dogma podcast I co-host with Dan Beecher, releases episodes every week that I've really enjoyed, and that's kind of longer form stuff. And then we've talked an awful lot about how the Bible is really an alien text, and the less we try to learn about its background and its history and its composition and its interpretation, the more we're just going to be bringing our intuitions to the text, and we're just going to make whatever meaning serves our interests. But I think the more that we use the discipline to be able to try to understand where the text is coming from, the more fascinating the text is, the more information there is in there for us, and hopefully the more we can overcome the dogmas that are kind of inherent to the traditional approaches to the Bible, which I think can contribute to greater unity and overcoming a lot of the parochial empathy that leads us to be antagonistic towards folks on the other side of the fence. But yeah, I think with greater understanding, we have a greater capacity to empathize and to communicate and to agree or productively disagree with others. So, yeah.
Dan, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. I thank you so much for your time.
You too.
And
Thank you.
last question for you: what's the fit today? You got one on?
Oh, I got my
Ah,
Data Over Dogma T-shirt on,
love it.
so repping the podcast today, which my co-host would be happy to see.
And we can buy that merch on your site, right?
I believe so. Yeah, we've been selling them at some of the book tour stops that I did in connection with the release of the book. But yeah, we should have the merch up on the site. I'll have to talk with my co-host and make sure that that's available. But he paid some money to have somebody professionally design some merch for us. I don't think he liked my amateur stuff that I was doing. So we had professional branding done. So hopefully that makes for a better merch.
Absolutely. Well, again, thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure. And
Thank
everybody,
you.
you're watching Peel the Onion. Until next time, be blessed.